Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to talk tonight about two topics. First, I'll address nullification, and the title of my presentation is James Madison Rebukes Nullification Deniers. And then I will talk about Article 5 Convention. And after both presentations, we'll then take questions from the audience on tonight's topic, not anything else, just the topic. James Madison rebukes nullification deniers. If James Madison were alive today, he would be amazed to see how people who claim to be on our side are misrepresenting what he said in his two major papers on resisting tyranny by the federal government. Law professor Randy Barnett, Robert Levy of the Cato Institute, everyone apparently at Heritage Foundation, David Barton, Human Events, and Mark Levin insist that nullification is unlawful, is literally impossible, that only the Supreme Court decides what is unconstitutional, and that James Madison was dead set against nullification. These are the nullification deniers. Their claims have been proven to be false. To persist in their claims is intellectually and morally indefensible. So why don't they apologize to the public and recant their errors? I suggest that they have been saying what we want to hear in order to gain our trust, so that once we trust them, we will accept the Article 5 Convention they are pushing as the only option left. But contrary to what they claim, I suggest the true purpose of an Article 5 Convention is to shove a new Constitution down our throats. So I will show you the glorious Constitution our framers gave us, how we lost it, how the nullification deniers are not telling the truth, what our framers actually told us to do when the federal government usurps power, and what James Madison really said about resistance to federal tyranny. I will be referring to the writings of our framers, including Madison's two major papers and to the deniers' papers. Hyperlinks are on my published paper, James Madison Rebukes Nullification Deniers, which is on my website. Nullification is simply the refusal to comply with unconstitutional acts of a government. Noncompliance can take various forms: direct disobedience, or any number of ways of obstructing, impeding, or thwarting. Our founding principles are set forth in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. This is our formal acknowledgement that we have a creator, and we are equal before the law. So we abolished titles of nobility at Article 1, Sections 9 and 10, but we did not fully live up to this principle because originally we permitted slavery. 2, rights come from God: life, liberty, to work and prosper, private property, self-defense, fair trials, and to live our lives free from interference, so long as we don't deprive other people of their God-given rights. Governments are to protect us from those who seek to take away our God-given rights. Rights come first, then governments to secure them. 3, people create governments. The first 3 words of our Constitution, "We the people," were the most radical ever written to establish a civil government. With those 3 words, we repudiated the English model, where political power originates with the king, and the German model, where political power originates with the state. In those models, people are subjects to the absolute will of the king or the state. But our Constitution is founded on the principle that the people are the pure original fountain of all legitimate political authority. Federalist Paper number 22, last paragraph, Alexander Hamilton. The 4th is this: when a government we created seeks to take away our God-given rights, we have the right, we have the duty to alter, abolish, or throw off such government. This is the natural right of self-defense, of nullification. It is a founding principle. The nullification deniers reject these founding principles. They have reverted to the authoritarian German model, where people are the subjects of the state and must obey the state, and the ultimate authority in this country is 5 judges on the Supreme Court. Our Constitution implements these founding principles. When we ratified our Constitution, we created the federal government. We are the creators. The federal government is our creature. Creature is the word Hamilton used in Federalist Paper number 33, and Thomas Jefferson used in the Kentucky resolutions at the 8th resolution, where he wrote that Congress is merely the creature of the compact between the states. We created a federal government, a federation of sovereign states united for limited and enumerated purposes only, with all other powers retained by the states or the people. We have the right to tell our creature what we are authorizing it to do. And that is precisely what we did in the Constitution, where we listed every power we delegated to our creature. Our creature has 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. We enumerated the powers we delegated to each branch. It is only with respect to these enumerated powers, those listed in the Constitution, that the federal government has lawful authority. The lists of enumerated powers are short. All our Constitution authorizes the federal government to do for the country at large falls into 4 categories. 1, military defense, international commerce and relations. 2, immigration and naturalization. 3, domestically, to create a uniform commercial system, weights and measures, patents and copyrights, money based on gold and silver, bankruptcy law, mail delivery, and some road building, and 4, with some of the amendments, secure certain civil rights. That's it. All other powers are reserved by the states or the people. The 10th Amendment confirms this. The federal government secures our God-given rights by exercising the enumerated powers listed in the Constitution. It isn't the federal government's job to secure our God-given rights in all ways, just in the ways appropriate for the national government of a federation. Our rights are to be secured in other ways by the states. The federal government is to secure our right to life by military defense, Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 11 through 16, by laws against piracy and other felonies on the high seas, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 10, by prosecuting traitors, Article 3, Section 3, by protecting us from invasion, Article 4, Section 4, and by restricting immigration, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1. Now that's a novel idea. It is to secure our property rights by establishing a money system based on gold and silver and by establishing uniform weights and measures, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5, by punishing counterfeiters, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 6, by establishing bankruptcy courts, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4, by issuing patents and copyrights, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8, and by regulating trade and commerce so we can produce, sell, and prosper, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. Now, the original intent of the Interstate Commerce Clause, as proved by Federalist Papers number 22 and 42, was to prohibit states from imposing taxes and tariffs on articles of commerce as they were transported through the states for purposes of buying and selling. That's it. And the federal government is to secure our right to liberty by laws against slavery, the 13th Amendment, by providing fair trials in federal courts, the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Amendments, and by obeying the Constitution. The reason our Constitution so strictly limits the powers of the federal government is to secure our basic right to be left alone, to live our lives free from meddlesome and interfering do-gooders, tyrants, bullies, and thieves. So this is how our federal Constitution implements that glorious founding principle that the sole purpose of civil government is to secure rights God gave us. And I just listed for you most of the enumerated powers. When a government merely secures God-given rights, we are never put in conflict with each other. When civil governments, state or federal, do nothing more than protect us from invaders, traitors, pirates, and thieves, the people can live together in peace because no one has his hand in anybody else's pocket. This is why our Constitution really was a 5,000-year miracle. But we let the miracle get perverted. We turned away from our founding principles. We began to pervert the federal government to benefit some at the expense of others. One of the first examples was the Tariff Act of 1828. The southern states were agricultural. They bought manufactured goods from England. England bought southern cotton. However, infant industries in the Northeast were producing some of the same manufactured goods as England, but they were more expensive than the imports. They couldn't compete. So, in 1828, Congress imposed a high tariff on the imports. The southern states called this the tariff of abominations because it made the English goods too expensive to buy, and when the southern states stopped buying English goods, England stopped buying southern cotton. This devastated the southern economy. Now, it is important to understand that Congress has specific authority to impose tariffs on imports, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. But even though the Tariff Act of 1828 was constitutional, It benefited manufacturers in the Northeast at the expense of the South by eliminating the competition. And thus, the Tariff Act violated our founding principle that governments exist to secure rights God gave us. God never gave us the right to be free of competition in business. We will talk more about this when we get to the South Carolina Nullification Act of 1832. How did we get to the socialist regulatory welfare state of today? It began with a change in theology. We rejected the faith of our fathers. The Unitarians took over Harvard University by 1805. Their social teaching spread throughout our culture. They rejected the biblical teaching that man is fallen, asserted that evil comes from the way society is organized, asserted that man is basically good. All man needs is the right education, and man and society will be made perfect. And they believed that they could educate children better than their parents. Remember, most Americans were homeschooled up to this time. So, during the 1840s, Horace Mann, a Unitarian, lobbied throughout the country for tax-supported public education and for special schools to train teachers. These teachers would be the experts on how to educate your children. You aren't qualified to teach your children. And then with public education, we would get utopia. With John Dewey, whose dates were 1859 to 1952, and who was an atheist and a socialist, the progressives took control of the teachers' colleges. They conditioned teachers to abandon our founders' philosophy of reason, fixed principles, limited civil government, and Judeo-Christian morality, and to accept the ideology of pragmatism, authoritarian government, and socialism. Progressives saw education as the tool for social and cultural reform to be achieved by remaking human nature. Our teachers' colleges thus produced many thousands of indoctrinated teachers who then corrupted our children in the public schools. Of course, there have been many very fine public school teachers. I personally had 4 of them. Now, remember that the Unitarians believed that evil comes from the environment, not from man. Man is basically good. But universal public education didn't bring about utopia. So something else in the environment must be causing the problems. So, in the early 1900s, the political progressives, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, promised that they would fix all these bad things in the environment. The progressives said they would meet all our needs and fix all our problems: poverty, illiteracy, greed, too many children, people who don't like immigrants, accidents at home, accidents at work, working conditions, unfair wages, lack of equal opportunity, overwork, underwork, bad investments, bad food, bad medicine, disease, injury, sickness, old age, and everything else. They claimed they would make business and commerce and agriculture fair by having the federal government control it all. So, it was the political progressives of the early 1900s who transformed the federal government into the Frankensteinian monster of today. It benefits some people, welfare parasites, people with government jobs, labor unions, and Obama donors, at the expense of others, and regulates us all so it can protect us from the risks and uncertainties of life and make everything fair. They claim the right to determine what is in the public interest and have the federal government implement their conceptions of what advances the public interest. So the federal government was no longer limited by the enumerated powers itemized in the Constitution, but followed the will of the people as expressed by their representatives in Congress. The federal government thus usurped a blank check to fill out any way they want. The regulatory welfare state is immoral and is destructive of the hallowed purpose for which the federal government was created. God never gave us the right to have governments give us an advantage over others, to be free from the challenges of life, to be protected from the consequences of our own actions, and to have others forced to pay our living expenses and subsidize our vices. So the progressives' conception of civil government is morally defective. In order to be the provider of benefits to some, the federal government must violate the God-given property rights of others. It must rob Peter to redistribute to Paul. In order to protect us from the risks and uncertainties of life, including made-up problems such as global warming and lack of medical insurance, it must violate everyone's God-given rights to liberty. Today, the federal government exercises vast powers not delegated in the Constitution, has become an instrument of oppression, injustice, and immorality, and has taken away most of our God-given rights and is conniving to take away our God-given right of self-defense. The federal government was transformed from being the securer of our God-given rights to a weapon used to oppress some of the people for the benefit of other people and to take everybody's liberty away except for those in the ruling class. So, what can we do? Does the creature dictate to the Creator? Who created Congress? Who created the executive branch? Who created the judicial branch? We did. Does the creature dictate to the Creator? The nullification deniers say yes. They say every law made by Congress, the legislative branch of the federal government, is supreme, and every executive order issued by the president and every word in the code of federal regulations, the executive branch of the federal government, is binding, and the states and we the people must obey unless and until 5 judges on the Supreme Court, the judicial branch of the federal government, say the law or executive order or agency rule is unconstitutional. In other words, Only the federal government may question the federal government, and no one may question the Supreme Court. They insist that the federal government created by the Constitution is the exclusive and final judge of the extent of its powers, and the opinion of 5 judges is the sole measure of its powers. The nullification deniers repudiate our founding principles. They would return us to the authoritarian governments which plagued Europe for 1,000 years, and we in this country would be ruled by 5. But our framers said the federal government is our creature, and each branch is to obey our will as enshrined in this Constitution. Thomas Jefferson said in the Kentucky Resolutions at the 8th resolution, where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy, that every state has a natural right in cases not within the compact to nullify of their own authority all assumptions of power by others within their limits, that without this right they would be under the dominion absolute and unlimited of whosoever might exercise this right of judgment for them. James Madison commented on this in his Notes on Nullification, written in 1834, quote, "The right of nullification meant by Mr. Jefferson is the natural right which all admit to be a remedy against insupportable oppression," end quote. Alexander Hamilton said in Federalist Paper number 28 at the last 5 paragraphs, and I'm condensing, "If the representatives of the people betray their constituents, then there is no recourse left but in the exertion of that original right of self-defense, which is paramount to all positive forms of government, and which, against the usurpations of the national rulers, may be exerted by the state governments, which will afford complete security against invasions of the public liberty by the national authority." Our framers told the states to resist unconstitutional acts of the federal government. Our framers saw nullification as a natural right, not a constitutional right. Some nullification deniers say states may not nullify anything the federal government does because nullification is not a constitutional right. Well, of course it is not a constitutional right. Rights don't come from the Constitution. Rights come from, as Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton said, nullification is the natural right of self-defense which predates and pre-exists the Constitution and the federal government. So the natural right of nullification, transcending as it does the Constitution and being nowhere prohibited by the Constitution of the states, is a reserved power within the meaning of the 10th Amendment. In Federalist number 45, Madison says, the powers delegated to the government to the federal government are few and defined, and all other powers are reserved to the several states. So it is the federal government which is supposed to look to the Constitution for the list of enumerated powers we, the people, delegated to it. The states don't go to the Constitution to look for permission because they retain all powers they didn't exclusively delegate to the federal government or prohibit to themselves in Article 1, Section 10. The nullification deniers pervert our Constitution. They permit the federal government to ignore the limits on its powers as enumerated in the Constitution, but insist the states can't do anything unless the Constitution says they can. What is nullification? A state nullifies or interposes when it stands between the federal government and the citizens of its state in order to protect them from the federal government. This takes various forms depending on the circumstances. Hamilton says in Federalist Paper number 33 at the 5th paragraph, quote, "If the federal government should overpass the just bounds of its authority and make a tyrannical use of its powers, the people whose creature it is must appeal to the standard they have formed," that's the Constitution, "and take such measures to redress the injury done to the Constitution as the exigency may suggest and prudence justify." Did you hear what Hamilton said? When the federal government usurps powers, we are the judge as to whether there is a violation, and we decide what we are going to do about it. Now listen carefully, because what I'm about to say is so difficult to understand that none of the nullification deniers get it. Our framers saw that before nullification is proper, the act of the government must be unconstitutional, a usurpation of a power not delegated, or a violation of the Constitution. And nullification takes various forms depending on the circumstances, from refusal to obey it to otherwise obstructing, impeding, or thwarting its enforcement. Here are some examples where refusal to obey is both proper and possible. Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King nullified the Jim Crow laws. These required black people to sit in the back of the bus. They couldn't eat in public places, use public restrooms, water fountains, and park benches. Using non-violent civil disobedience, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King led black people to refuse to obey these state or municipal laws, which were unconstitutional under Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. This is how brave citizens nullify unconstitutional laws. They refuse to obey. They say, "We won't comply." Just as the brave citizens in Connecticut are doing when they refuse to obey the unconstitutional state law which purports to require them to register their firearms. Article 1. Article 1, Section 15 of the Connecticut Constitution says, "All citizens in Connecticut may keep and bear arms." I'm paraphrasing, but that's the gist. If you're a citizen in Connecticut, you can be armed. It doesn't say anything about registration. Prayer in the public schools. The Constitution does not delegate to the federal government power to ban Christianity, but in 1962, the Supreme Court started ordering the states to stop the praying and remove the 10 Commandments. Since those orders were usurpations of powers not delegated, not possessed by the federal government, the states should have nullified them by directing their schools to ignore them. Disarming the American people. If Congress by law, or the President by executive order, or the BATF by rule, or the Supreme Court by opinion, or the federal government by UN treaty, orders the people to turn in our arms, we must refuse to comply. The Constitution doesn't authorize the federal government to disarm us. So the states and the people must nullify such law or order or rule or opinion or treaty by refusing to obey. All nullification requires is a spine. Here is an example where other ways of resistance than direct disobedience were appropriate. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798 objected to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which purported to grant to the president dictatorial powers over aliens and seditious words. The states couldn't refuse to obey the acts because they were directed to the powers of the president. So the resolutions showed the acts were unconstitutional and asked other states to cooperate in taking whatever prudent and possible measures needed to be taken to defend the Constitution, the states, and the people. During 1799-1800, Madison, who wrote the Virginia resolutions of 1798, presented his report on the Virginia resolutions to the Virginia legislature. In this report, Madison said, under his discussion of the third resolution, and I'm condensing what he said, "The states, in their sovereign capacity, are the parties to the constitutional compact and are thus the final authority on whether the federal government has violated the Constitution. There can be no tribunal above the authority of the states to decide whether the compact made by them has been violated by the federal government. That if, when the federal government usurps powers, the states don't stop the usurpation and thereby preserve the Constitution, there would be no relief from usurped power. This would subvert the rights of the people as well as betray the fundamental principle of our founding. That when the federal government acts outside the Constitution by usurping powers, then the sovereign states, who are the parties to the Constitution, must appeal to that original natural right of self-defense. That the judicial branch is as likely to usurp as are the other two branches. Thus, the sovereign states have as much right to judge the usurpations of the judicial branch as they do the legislative and executive branches. That all three branches of the federal government obtain their delegated powers from the Constitution, and they may not annul the authority of their creator, and we are the creator. And if the judicial branch connives with other branches in usurping powers, as it did when it upheld Obamacare, our Constitution will be destroyed. So the judicial branch does not have final say as to the rights of the parties to the constitutional compact. Otherwise, the delegation of judicial power would annul the authority delegating it, and the concurrence of the judicial branch with other branches in usurping power would subvert the Constitution forever. That is what Madison said in his report of 1800 to the Virginia legislature. The nullification deniers are misrepresenting what Madison said, or they are ignorantly regurgitating what they have heard others say Madison said. Randy Barnett, law professor, wrote a paper where he quoted Madison's discussion of the seventh resolution in this same report and claimed it shows that Madison, quote, expressly denies or at a minimum equivocates about whether there is a literal power of nullification in the states, end quote. Barnett ignored everything Madison said under the third resolution, falsely claimed that Madison conceded that the Supreme Court alone decides whether acts of the federal government are unconstitutional, and showed he doesn't understand that nullification takes various forms depending on the nature of the unconstitutional act, from direct refusal to obey the act to other forms of obstructing, impeding, or thwarting enforcement. And so Barnett chanted the standard authoritarian refrain, "What has the Supreme Court said and meant? And are there now 5 justices to sustain the claim?" In the September 4, 2013 issue of the New York Times, Robert Levy, chairman of the Cato Institute, regurgitated the same lie that Madison said in his report of 1800 to the Virginia legislature, that all the states can do is express their opinion that a federal law is unconstitutional. Levy too then chanted the standard authoritarian refrain, "In assessing constitutionality, our system of governance recognizes one Supreme Court, not 50 individual states." I say to these nullification deniers, shame on you for misrepresenting what Madison said or for ignorantly repeating lies others before you told without checking it out to see if what you are repeating is true. The so-called nullification crisis of 1832 brings us to 2 more nullification deniers who misrepresent something else James Madison wrote. Matthew Spalding, PhD, of Heritage Foundation, and David Barton wrote papers where they cite James Madison's notes on South Carolina's theory of nullification as proof that Madison vehemently opposed nullification. One wonders how Spalding and Barton can be so lacking in critical thinking skills that they cannot make the distinction between the nullification doctrine Madison and Jefferson and Hamilton embraced and the bizarre theory advanced by South Carolina. Our framers understood before nullification is proper, the act of the government must be unconstitutional. Our Constitution delegates to Congress authority to impose tariffs on imports, and the tariff must be the same in each state. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. So, can you see something which Matthew Spalding and David Barton can't see? South Carolina wanted to nullify a constitutional law. In Madison's notes on nullification written in 1834, he discussed South Carolina's bizarre theory that a state has a constitutional right to nullify any federal law, and the nullification is presumed valid unless 3/4 of the states say it isn't valid. Madison opposed South Carolina's bizarre theory. He said, "The federal government has delegated authority to impose tariffs. The Constitution requires that tariffs be uniform throughout the United States. States can't nullify tariffs authorized by the Constitution. 1/4 of the states don't have the right to dictate to 3/4 of the states on matters within the powers delegated to the federal government, and nullification is not a constitutional right. Near the end of his notes, Madison quoted with approval Thomas Jefferson's famous statement, "But where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy, that every state has a natural right, in cases not within the compact, to nullify of their own authority all assumptions of power by others within their limits." And that's when Madison says, thus the right of nullification meant by Mr. Jefferson is the natural right which all admit to be a remedy against insubordinable oppression. Do you see how the nullification deniers misrepresent what Madison said? Or are they so shamelessly lazy that they just copy what other people have already said? Application today. When we, the people, ratified our Constitution and created the federal government, we did not delegate to our creature power to control our medical care, invade our homes, disarm us, dictate what is done in the schools, and all the thousands of things they dictate. We never gave them authority in the Constitution to do. Accordingly, each state has a natural right to nullify such unconstitutional dictates within its borders. These dictates are outside the compact the sovereign states made with each other. We never gave our creature authority over these objects. As Jefferson and Madison said, without nullification, the states and the people would be under the absolute and unlimited control of the federal government. And that is where these nullification deniers, with their false assertions and shameful misrepresentations, would put you. To sum up, nullification is a natural right of self-defense. It is a founding principle. Rights don't come from the Constitution, they come from God. The second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence says we have the duty to smack down tyrannical government. Nullification is a reserved power within the meaning of the 10th Amendment, and nullification is required by oath of office. Article 6, Clause 3 requires all state officers and judges to support the federal Constitution. So when the federal government violates the Constitution, the states must smack them down. Their oath requires it. Our founders and framers were manly men who knew statecraft and political philosophy and could think. But our experts of today have been indoctrinated with authoritarianism and can't think. They lie or they ignorantly repeat the prevailing authoritarian dogma. So, we the people must man up, throw off the indoctrination, reclaim the moral high ground which is rightfully ours. Learn our founding documents, trust no one to tell you the truth, and repudiate cowardice as the proper response to the evil which is overtaking our land. Thank you. Would you look at the box with the charts in it? And now for the controversial topic. I've prepared handout sheets. On one sheet of paper, I set forth our complete system, the Declaration of Independence, the federal system, the powers, the enumerated powers delegated to the federal government, and the reserved powers of the states. It's all on one sheet of paper. It'll be, after I finish speaking, it'll be for you well, we'll hand out copies, okay. With this Constitution, we created the federal government, a federation of states united for limited and enumerated purposes only, with all other powers reserved by the states or the people. In this little book, we listed the powers delegated to the federal government. It is only with respect to the enumerated powers that the federal government has lawful authority. As we discussed before, and I'll just repeat it because it's important, all our Constitution authorizes the federal government to do for the country at large falls into those 4 categories listed earlier: military defense, international commerce and relations, immigration and naturalization, domestically create a uniform commercial system, weights and measures, patents and copyrights, bankruptcy laws, money system based on gold and silver, mail delivery and some road building, and 4, with some of the amendments, secure certain civil rights. That's it. All other powers are reserved by the states or the people, and the chart you'll be getting illustrates our glorious system on one page. It was our duty to enforce our Constitution and make our public servants obey it. But long ago, we stopped reading our Declaration and Constitution, and because we didn't know what they say, we were unable to do our duty to watch over and discipline our servants. We allowed our servants to bribe us into surrendering our liberties. That was the purpose of the unconstitutional government assistance programs of the early 1900s, Social Security in the 1930s, and Medicare in the 1960s, to demoralize us, strip us of personal responsibility, and make us dependents, so that we would dance to the tune of our servants instead of making them dance to ours. Their tune is tyranny. Our tune is the liberty enshrined in our Declaration and Constitution. The federal government has ignored our Constitution for 100 years. State governments have ignored it for 100 years. And we, the people who ordained and established it, don't have a clue what it says about anything. That is the problem: universal ignorance of these 2 documents. But organizations such as the Convention of States say the problem is the Constitution. They say the problem is, the solution is, amend the Constitution. Yes, when everybody ignores the Constitution and we, the people, have no idea what it says about anything, all we need to do is amend it and all will start obeying it. They say they want an Article 5 convention, and it's just to propose amendments. They say states will appoint the delegates, control the delegates, each state will get 1 vote at the convention, and Congress has no power over the convention. The states run the whole show. And they say they know this because law professor Rob Natelson says these were the customs followed in conventions, he says, took place all the time during our founding era. And they say Congress will follow these same customs when Congress calls a convention under Article 5. But folks, we have never had a convention under Article 5. So there is no precedent. Nadelson's customs are irrelevant. Article 5 provides two methods of amending the Constitution. Congress proposes amendments or calls a convention to propose amendments if 34 states apply for it. The first method was used for our existing 27 amendments. Congress proposed them all. Under the second method, Congress calls the convention. A call is the official summons for a convention to take place. It states the date and location, how delegates will be appointed, etc. We all know what it means to call a meeting. If you call a meeting, you decide who, where, and when. Furthermore, Article 1, Section 8, last clause, the necessary and proper clause, delegates to Congress the power to make the laws to carry out the call. Now, Congress gets its legal research from the Congressional Research Service, the CRS. CRS just released a report to instruct Congress on the issues under an Article 5 convention. Here is a portion of the CRS report issued March the 7th, 2014. See me after, and I've got the information so you can find it online. The Congressional Research Service confirms that Article 5 delegates to Congress exclusive authority over both methods of amendment. The CRS report shows that in Congress's preliminary preparations for Article 5 conventions in the past, Congress has provided that delegates to an Article 5 convention would receive immunity from arrest, and Congress has planned to apportion delegates the same as in the Electoral College. So California would get 55 delegates and Alaska would get 3. So if Congress permits the states to participate in the convention, Congress decides whether each state will get 1 vote or whether the state's electoral votes will determine how many votes they get. Congress may decide to appoint the delegates themselves. Nothing requires Congress to permit states to select delegates. Congress can appoint themselves as delegates. And Congress has the power to grant delegates immunity from prosecution. The Convention of States people insist they know exactly how a convention will operate, but page 25 of the Congressional Research Service report says, quote, "In the final analysis, the question, what sort of convention, is not likely to be resolved unless or until the 34-state threshold has been crossed and a convention assembles," end quote. The CRS says we'll have to get a convention before we know how it's going to operate. Yeah. Page 25. The Convention of States says we need a convention to propose amendments to limit the size and scope of the federal government. Rubbish. Our Constitution already limits the powers of the federal government to those few and defined powers listed in the Constitution and on the chart. They don't want to limit the size and scope of the federal government. We know this because the amendments they propose add new powers to the federal government or legalize powers the feds have already usurped. Let's look at 3 of their amendments. Michael Ferris, the head of the Convention of States, is pushing a parental rights amendment which he says would protect parental rights. But it does the opposite. It expressly delegates power over children to the federal government. Here is his amendment. See me after. Mark Levin's amendments also do the opposite of what he says. His amendment to limit the federal bureaucracy legalizes what are now unconstitutional federal agencies: education, energy, agriculture, DHS, HUD, HHS, EPA, etc., etc., etc. Our Constitution doesn't authorize these agencies, but Levin's amendment legalizes them. Article 1, Section 1 of our Constitution says only Congress may make laws. But since Woodrow Wilson, federal agencies have been writing rules. This is the abominable code of federal regulations. All these rules are unconstitutional as outside the scope of powers delegated and as in violation of Article 1, Section 1. But Levin's amendment to limit the federal bureaucracy legalizes these rules and rulemaking. Levin's amendment to limit federal spending is also phony. Our Constitution limits federal spending to the enumerated powers. Most of what Congress may lawfully spend money on is listed on the chart. If you go through the Constitution and highlight the powers delegated to Congress and to the President, you will get a complete list of the objects Congress is authorized to spend money on. That is how our framers controlled spending. But Levin's amendment substitutes a budget for the enumerated powers, and while it pretends to limit spending to revenues, it actually permits Congress to suspend the spending limit and continue to raise the national debt. They are deceptive when they say they want amendments to limit the size and scope of the federal government. Their amendments institutionalize the very abuses they purport to correct, nullify the natural rights of the people, and fundamentally change the constitutional design. Even though our Constitution is not being enforced, it still declares this federal government lawless. The true rule of law is still on our side, but not for much longer if we foolishly allow our Constitution to be rewritten. Convention of States says we must amend the Constitution because people in Washington don't understand it. Rubbish. Our Constitution is so simple that Alexander Hamilton said, "The people are the natural guardians of the Constitution." Federalist Paper number 16, next to the last paragraph. For clauses the Supreme Court perverted: interstate commerce clause, general welfare, and necessary and proper clause. A quick look in the Federalist Paper shows the original intents. We don't need a convention to draft amendments showing what these clauses mean. Look it up in the Federalist, but I've already done it. It's all on it's all on this one sheet of paper in large type, the original intent of those three clauses, and I proved it, and you can have a copy. Convention of States says we must amend the Constitution to restore powers the feds have taken from the states. Rubbish. The 10th Amendment says all powers not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution are reserved to the states or the people. What happened to those reserved powers? The states sold them to the federal government. God gave parents the duty to educate their children. But state governments ripped this sacred duty from parents and forced their children into government schools, and now into federal education schemes such as Common Core. They did it for the federal grant money. DHS is nationalizing local and state law enforcement. DHS answers to Obama. Who issues your driver's licenses? Do you know about the fusion centers in every state? The states acquiesced in this takeover. They did it for the federal funds and the free combat equipment. Why do they want combat equipment? Thanks to state governments, Obama is getting a national police force, the Obama version of the East German Stasi, and we are losing local control of law enforcement. Federal funds make up over 1/3 of the state's annual budgets. The states don't want to rein in the feds. They don't want to lose their federal funding. This session, State Senator May Beavers introduced an Obamacare nullification bill into the Tennessee legislature. But the fiscal note said that if her bill passed, Tennessee would lose $6 billion in federal funds. Well, we can't lose that. So Tennessee is not going to nullify Obamacare. State governments are not victims of federal tyranny. They are collaborators in federal tyranny. For 50 years, progressives have tried to get an Article 5 convention, but we stopped them. So, Convention of States repackaged the push for an Article 5 convention. They now frame it as an issue of states' rights versus the federal government. They falsely portray the states as victims of federal tyranny. And they fabricated the preposterous claim that our framers said the purpose of amendments is to rein in the federal government if it usurps powers. We must distinguish between defects in a constitution and a government's refusal to obey the constitution to which it is subject. There were defects in our constitution: slavery. Amendments fix defects, but our problem is a disobedient federal and state governments. That calls for different remedies, and our framers spelled them out. Resistance, nullification. Our framers never said that the purpose of amendments is to rein in the feds if they usurp powers. One delegate at the Federal Convention of 1787, George Mason, said something along those lines, but he was in the minority. He didn't get his way, and he refused to sign the Constitution. Mason objected to Congress controlling the amendment process. On the last day of deliberations, the convention method of proposing amendments was added, but since Congress calls the convention, Congress still controls both methods, as the CRS report confirms. And Mason refused to sign the Constitution. What our framers, those who signed the Constitution, actually said is that amendments remedy defects in the Constitution, that amendment of errors and useful alterations would be suggested by experience, that the novelty and difficulty of what they were doing would require periodic revision, that useful amendments would address the organization of the government, not the mass of its powers. Now, think about the silliness of the claim that the purpose of amendments is to control the feds. Consider federal gun control laws, background checks, BATF rules, outlawing of shotguns shorter than 18 inches. Where does our Constitution delegate to the federal government power to restrict our arms? It doesn't. They do it anyway. So, if we get an amendment saying that the federal government can't infringe our right to keep and bear arms, will that rein in the feds? If we have a convention, our Constitution and Declaration will be put on the executioner's block. The Convention of States, people say a convention is safe because 3/4 of the states have to ratify whatever comes out. That is false. We must distinguish between ratification of amendments and ratification of a new constitution. It is easier to ratify a constitution than to ratify amendments. I'll show you. The Articles of Confederation required all 13 states to ratify amendments. But at the Federal Convention of 1787, where this Constitution was drafted, our framers saw that they were unlikely to get 13 states to ratify this Constitution. So they provided at Article 7 of this Constitution that it would only require 9 states for ratification, 13 states to ratify amendments to the Articles of Confederation, but only 9 states to ratify the new Constitution. Now listen, if another convention is called, the delegates are invested with the inherent sovereign right of a people to alter or abolish their form of government. Declaration of Independence, 2nd paragraph. Look at the Convention of 1787 where this was drafted. Pursuant to Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation, the Continental Congress resolved on February the 21st, 1787, to call a convention to be held at Philadelphia, quote, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation, end quote. And here is the official call by the Continental Congress. But the delegates ignored that limitation and wrote a new constitution. Because of the inherent authority of delegates, it is impossible to stop it from happening at another convention. So this is how our framers could lawfully come up with a new constitution at the Convention of 1787, instead of merely proposing amendments to the Articles of Confederation. If we have a convention now, George Washington, James Madison, Ben Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton won't be there to protect you. You don't know who the delegates will be, but they will have the power to impose a new constitution. A new constitution is already prepared. 50 years ago, the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations produced the Constitution for the New States of America. It is ratified by a referendum called by the President. The states are dissolved and replaced by regions answerable to the national government. If we have a convention and the delegates propose the new state's constitution, it doesn't go to the states for ratification. Oh, no, no, no. It goes directly to the president to call a referendum. And you know the votes will be counted honestly. Progressives have been trying for 50 years to get a new constitution. That's why they have been pushing for an Article 5 convention, because the only way they can get rid of this glorious constitution and replace it with their hellish constitution is to have an Article 5 convention. Chief Justice Warren Burger warned in his letter to Phyllis Schlafly, quote, "There is no effective way to limit or muzzle the actions of a constitutional convention," end quote. Quote, "After a convention is convened, it will be too late to stop the convention if we don't like its agenda. A new convention could plunge our nation into constitutional confusion and confrontation at every turn, with no assurance that focus would be on the subjects needing attention." James Madison said in his famous letter to James Turberville, and here's his letter, that he trembled at the prospect of a second convention, and that if there were an Article 5 convention, the most violent partisans and individuals of insidious views would strive to be delegates and would have a dangerous opportunity of sapping the very foundations of the fabric of our country. We all know that our federal and state governments are filled with ignorant and corrupt people. If there is a convention, ignorant and corrupt people will be selecting the delegates, and these delegates will have the power to impose a new constitution with whatever method of ratification seems to them most likely to ensure success. What I am warning you about is more likely to happen than not. Jordan Sillers, Communications Director for Convention of States, posted a comment on my Facebook page where he said, quote, "I think the majority of Americans are too lazy to elect honest politicians, but I think some men and women could be found who are morally and intellectually capable of rewriting the Constitution," end quote. I took a screenshot of Sillers' comment and have a link to it in my latest questions and answers on my website. Who is behind this push for an Article 5 convention? Look behind the curtain Mark Levin and Michael Ferris are putting up. Attorney Joe Wolverton's article with the John Birch Society, titled "Socialist and Soros Fight for Article 5 Convention," end quote, shows that George Soros, that financier of global fascism, is funding some of this push for an Article 5 convention. Wolverton also links to MoveToAmend.org, which lists hundreds of fascist socialist groups clamoring to amend the Constitution. Yet, Convention of States suggests that only moral and intelligent people will be at this convention. No progressives, no fascists, just fine, moral, and intelligent people dedicated to the Constitution. I say shame on Mark Levin and Michael Ferris for selling this poison desperate Americans are swallowing. Nothing in Article 5 gives states any authority over a convention. The power to call the convention is delegated to Congress. I can point to the text of Article 5 and to the text of Article 1, Section 8, last clause, the necessary and proper clause, as authority for the fact that power over the convention method is delegated to Congress alone. The report of the Congressional Research Service confirms this. Mark Levin and the COS people have no authority for their claims that the states control the convention. All they can do is babble about Rob Nadelson's customs, chant the words of a dissenter at the Federal Convention of 1787 who refused to sign the Constitution because he didn't get his way, and tell you stories about the hidden clauses of Article 5. Our system depended on we, the people, knowing and enforcing these two documents and having the virtue and intelligence to select representatives of virtue and wisdom. We lost our virtue and became ignorant and unthinking, so we elect ignorant and corrupt people to office. That is why our situation is so wretched. No amendment can render us secure when there is no virtue or intelligence in the people. Hamilton expected us to be a people enlightened enough to distinguish between a legal exercise and an illegal usurpation of authority. Federalist number 16 next to the last paragraph. Americans once learned in grammar school the things I write and speak about. If we knew these documents, we could vet candidates. We've been deceived by ignorant phonies because we are ignorant. We must stop letting others choose our political heroes. We are told the candidates at CPAC are our stars. One of them will save us, but they are phonies. Anyone who supports a balanced budget amendment doesn't understand the enumerated powers restriction on Congress's spending or rejects that constitutional restriction. We must stop the hero worship. Politicians are not our saviors. We are not to adore them. They are our servants, and they are good servants only if they are faithful to this. So what did our framers say the states are supposed to do when the federal government usurps power? They never said that when the feds ignore the Constitution, we should amend the Constitution. What our framers actually said, as you saw earlier tonight, is that the states are to resist unconstitutional acts of the federal government. Don't comply. Say, no, not in my state. We must elect to our state legislatures people who have the spine to do this. Our framers told us to resist. It is insane to believe that the remedy for a usurping federal government is to amend the document they violate. Thank you so much.